The atmosphere inside the grand lectern of the Ethelgard Institute felt like a cold blade pressed against a jugular. It was a sterile, pressurized scent, a cocktail of recycled oxygen, ozone, and the metallic tang of collective fear. For the 300 cadets seated in the tiered obsidian rows, this was the moment of reckoning. Above them, the needle's rotation cast long, rhythmic shadows across the clinical white floor, a reminder that they were floating in the heart of the void tier, where the laws of physics were merely suggestions. Matriarch Hesperia entered the hall. She did not walk. She glided with the haunting elegance of her corvid lineage. Her cloak, woven from iridescent dark feathers that shimmered like oil on water, brushed against the floor with a dry, papery sound. Her face was hidden behind a ceremonial porcelain mask, the beak long and sharp, eyes replaced by two glowing violet sensors that swept the room with predatory precision. When she reached the central dais, the ambient murmur died instantly. "Welcome to the precipice," Hesperia said. Her voice was not a sound, but a vibration that hummed in the bones of every student. "You are not here to study the universe. You are here to stitch it together before it unspools." High above her, the Loom-Silt lattice began to glow. It was a web of translucent, crystalline threads that snaked through the architecture of the station, pulsating with a soft, bioluminescent rhythm. This was the Loom-Silt, a substance capable of recalculating the probability of existence itself. Usually during orientation, the lattice remained dormant, a quiet guardian of the station's integrity. Today, however, the air began to ripple like heat over asphalt. The lattice was agitated. It was searching. In the very last row, where the shadows were deepest and the ventilation hummed loudest, Kaelen Voss sat motionless. He wore the standard-issue gray tactical suit, the fabric slightly worn at the cuffs. His dark hair was short, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. While the cadets in the front rows fidgeted with their wrist links or exchanged nervous glances, Kaelen was a statue. He had spent the last 3 years mastering the art of being background noise. He was the smudge on a lens, the static in a recording. He was designed to be overlooked. Yet as the Loom-Silt began to swirl, the sensors on the ceiling ignored the valedictorians in the first row. They bypassed the high-ranking heirs of the inner systems. A dozen optical nodes swiveled in unison, locking onto the dim corner of the back row. Kaelen felt it first, a sudden drop in temperature that turned his breath into a white mist. His pulse didn't quicken. It slowed, a rhythmic thud that sounded like a funeral drum in his ears. "Matriarch," a voice whispered from the dais. It was Kira, the leader of the Apex Girls. She stood to Hesperia's right, her silver loop and fur bristling under her crimson uniform. Her hand was hovering over her data slate, her eyes wide with confusion. "The telemetry is fracturing. The system is ignoring the roster. It's locking onto a non-variable." Hesperia did not turn her head. "Initiate the resonance scan. Let us see who the void is calling for." Kira hesitated, then pressed the command key. A beam of coherent violet light snapped across the hall. It didn't sweep the rows in a grid pattern as it was programmed to. It lunged. The beam hit the back wall, illuminating Kaelen in a harsh, interrogative glare. For a second, nothing happened. Kaelen sat bathed in the light, his expression unreadable, almost bored. Then the reality around him began to stutter. The student sitting 3 seats away, a boy named Jackson who had been bragging about his father's fleet 10 minutes prior, let out a sharp, choked gasp. The violet light hitting Kaelen didn't stop at his skin. It fractured, ricocheting off him as if he were a mirror of impossible density. A jagged splinter of that light slammed into Jackson's chest. There was no explosion. There was only the sound of a heavy tapestry being ripped in half. "Help!" Jackson whispered. His voice sounded miles away, coming from the bottom of a deep well. He tried to stand, but his legs were becoming transparent. The gray fabric of his suit was turning into streaming lines of binary code and static. The air around him hissed as if escaping a vacuum. In less than 5 seconds, Jackson's eyes widened with a terror that surpassed death. And then, he was gone. The seat was empty. Not just empty of a person, but empty of air, empty of dust. A sharp crack of thunder echoed through the hall as the atmosphere rushed in to fill the void where a human being had stood heartbeats before. Silence slammed into the room, absolute and suffocating. 300 cadets stopped breathing at the same time. Kaelen reached down and brushed a speck of invisible dust from his knee. He hadn't moved to help. He hadn't recoiled. He had simply watched the unspooling with the detached interest of a man watching rain. Security Protocol Alpha 9, Hesperia's voice boomed, the porcelain mask reflecting the emergency red lights that began to strobe. Lock the doors. No one leaves this chamber. She turned her violet sensors toward the back row. The air around her vibrated with suppressed violence. She was no longer looking at a student. She was looking at an anomaly. Bring him down, Hesperia commanded. Now. The Apex girls moved instantly. They were the enforcers of Ethelgard, a squad of predators trained to handle reality shifts. Kira led the way, her silver tail held low, her claws extending with a soft schlick sound. Beside her was Celine, her crystalline skin glowing with a faint blue pulse of bioelectricity. They ascended the stairs in a diamond formation, their movements synchronized and efficient. The other students parted like water before a shark, pressing themselves against the edges of their seats, terrified that even a touch from Kaelen might delete them from existence. Kira reached the back row first. She stopped 2 meters away from Kaelen's desk, her nostrils flaring as she caught his scent. He smelled of cheap soap and old iron. Stand up, asset, Kira ordered. Her voice was ice, sharp and cold. Kaelen slowly uncrossed his legs. He stood. He was taller than he appeared while seated, his frame lean but possessing a strange density, as if he occupied more space than he should. You've made a mess of the schedule, Kaelen said. His voice was dry, lacking any inflection of fear. You've done more than that? Kira hissed, her golden eyes narrowing. You just unspooled a cadet. Do you have any idea what kind of paperwork that causes? I didn't touch him, Kaelen replied. The system did. Maybe your machine is broken. Celine stepped forward, her hands pressed against her temples. To her empathic senses, Kaelen wasn't a quiet boy. He was a screaming storm. She could hear the bioelectric rhythm of his heart, and it wasn't beating like a human's. It was a slow, heavy thud that resonated with the station's core. He's not doing it on purpose, Celine whispered to Kira. Her voice sounded like wind through hollow reeds. He's holding it in. There's so much noise under his skin. It's like he's a container for 1,000 ghosts. Kaelen's gaze shifted to Celine. For a fraction of a second, his mask slipped. Something flickered in his eyes. A flash of raw, jagged grief that made Celine recoil, as if she had been burned. Enough, Kira cut in. She grabbed Kaelen's arm, her grip iron. You're coming with us to the isolation wing. Am I under arrest? Kaelen asked, looking at the silver fur on her hand. You are under scrutiny, Kira corrected, pulling him toward the stairs, which in this academy is significantly worse. As they marched him down, the students watched in a silence so thick it felt like physical weight. Kaelen didn't look back. He didn't look at the empty seat where Jackson had been. He kept his eyes on the ground, counting his steps. 150 steps to the dais, 210 steps to the blast doors. Inside the grand lectern, Matriarch Hesperia watched them leave. When the doors hissed shut, she turned back to her console. She bypassed the official logs and accessed the deep-layer diagnostics of the scan. The screen flooded with fractals of probability and error codes. The scan hadn't malfunctioned. It hadn't glitched. It had recognized him. A secure channel on her console blinked. A priority message, encrypted with a cipher that predated the Institute itself, appeared in cold white text. Asset located. Prototype 7, detected in back row. Initiate Phase 2. Hesperia stared at the words, her violet sensors pulsing. She looked at the closed doors where Kaelen had been taken. Who are you really, Kaelen Voss? She whispered to the empty room. She thought she knew. She had admitted him after all. She had reviewed his forged transcripts, his unremarkable record from the Outer Rim, his psych profile that read stable but withdrawn. She had thought he was just another stray, another piece of debris from the war that she could mold into a tool. But the Loom-Silt did not hunt strays. The Loom-Silt hunted truth. Hesperia deactivated the console and smoothed the feathers of her cloak. The game had changed. For the first time in 50 years, she wasn't sure if she was the player or the pawn. She tapped her comms unit. Dr. Vaughn, report to the isolation wing immediately. Bring the deep dive neuroscanner. And doctor, do not ask questions. The corridor to the isolation wing was silent save for the rhythmic clicking of Kira's boots against the obsidian floor. Kaelen walked in the center of the formation, his hands held in magnetic cuffs that hummed with a low-frequency suppression field. He didn't fight. He didn't struggle. He simply walked, a ghost in a gray suit, moving toward the dark heart of the needle. The isolation cell was a cube of reinforced polycarbonate in lead, 6 meters on each side. It was flooded with high-intensity white light that left no room for shadows. There was no bed, no chair, only a single silver pedestal in the center. Kaelen Voss sat on the floor, his back against the cold wall, eyes closed. He was practicing the silence. It was a mental discipline he had learned in the ruins of Obscura Reach 10 years ago. You visualize a box of thick, black lead. You take every memory, every scream, every flash of burning atmosphere, and you shove it inside. Then you lock it. But today, the box was vibrating. The Loom-Silt on the station was singing to the silt buried in his own marrow. The heavy blast door hissed open. Kira stepped in, followed by a woman in a clinical white coat, Dr. Vaughn. Kira looked restless, her hand never straying far from her stunned baton. She didn't trust the silence of the boy on the floor. Sit on the pedestal, Dr. Vaughn ordered. Her voice was thin and academic. Kaelen opened his eyes. He stood up slowly and complied. The magnetic cuffs were removed, but he knew the room was lined with gravity dampeners. If he made a sudden move, he would be crushed into the floor before he could blink. Dr. Vaughn began to circle him, a handheld scanner chirping as it passed over his skin. I've seen your file, Voss. Born on a mining colony in the Outer Rim. Parents deceased in an industrial accident. Routine service in the Merchant Navy. She stopped in front of him, her eyes narrowing. It's a very neat file, almost too neat. Like a garden where someone has pulled every single weed. I like order, Kaelen said. Order is a lie in this sector, Dr. Vaughn countered. She tapped a command on her slate. The air above Kaelen shivered, and a holographic projection of his internal anatomy appeared. It was normal at first glance. Heart, lungs, skeletal structure. But as the doctor increased the resolution, the bones began to glow with a faint violet luminescence. What is this? Kira asked, stepping closer. Her lupin ears flattened against her skull. It's not radiation, Dr. Vaughn whispered, her professional mask slipping. It's integration. His nervous system isn't just carrying electrical signals, it's carrying Loom-Silt. She looked at Kaelen, her face pale. How are you still alive? This level of silt density should have unspooled your brain years ago. You should be a puddle of static on a hangar floor. I'm a slow learner, Kaelen replied. Kira grabbed the front of his suit, lifting him slightly off the pedestal. Listen to me, you piece of junk. A student is gone. Jackson is gone. His parents are high-ranking officials in the Obsidian hegemony. If I can't give them a reason why their son was deleted, they'll turn this station into a scrapyard. Then tell them the truth, Kaelen said, his eyes meeting hers. Tell them the Institute is playing with toys it doesn't understand. Kira's eyes flashed gold. You think you're smart? You think because the headmistress is interested in you, you're safe? In Ethelgard, interest is a death sentence. She shoved him back. Celine entered the room then, her crystalline skin dim, as if she were exhausted. She looked at Kaelen with a mixture of pity and terror. The Matriarch wants a resonance test, Celine said. She wants to see the reach. Kalen's breath hitched. It was the first time his composure had cracked. The reach? There is no reach. It was destroyed. Obscura Reach was a ghost colony, Celine said, her voice soft like falling glass. Everyone knows the story. A solar flare hit the atmosphere, ignited the gas mines, and turned the planet into a cinder. No survivors. She took a step toward him, her hands glowing with a soft blue light. But the Loom-Silt doesn't believe in stories, Kaelen. It remembers the truth. And you are the loudest memory on the station. Celine placed her hand on Kalen's forehead. The world caught fire. Flash. Kaelen isn't 18. He's 8. The sky over Obscura Reach isn't blue. It's the color of a fresh bruise, purple and swollen with the weight of obsidian hegemony warships. The air doesn't smell like oxygen. It smells like burning hair and melting plastic. He is lying on a cold metal table. There are men in white masks, their eyes cold and detached. Subject 7 is showing high compatibility, a voice says. It's a voice Kaelen will never forget. Smooth, cultured, and utterly heartless. Exarch Malachor. Initiate the graft, Malachor orders. Kaelen screams, but there is no sound. He feels something being poured into his veins. It's not liquid. It's millions of microscopic needles, each one a grain of Loom-Silt, sewing itself into his nerves. They aren't just changing his body. They are changing his connection to time. He can see the next 10 seconds before they happen. He can see the doctor's knife before it cuts. He can see the colony dying before the first bomb falls. Flash. The laboratory explodes. Not from a bomb, but from a surge of probability. The Loom-Silt reacts to Kaelen's agony. Reality around him begins to fold. The doctors are unspooled, their bodies turning into ribbons of light. The walls melt into liquid glass. Kaelen stands up. He is small, covered in blood and soot. He looks out the window and sees the sky tearing open. The obsidian hegemony isn't here to mine ore. They are here to mine him. Flash. Kaelen pulled away from Celine, gasping for air. He fell off the pedestal, his hands trembling as he gripped the cold floor. The silence was gone. The box was broken. Celine stumbled back, her crystalline skin cracking with a spiderweb of dark lines. She was weeping blue, glowing tears. "I saw it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw the fire." "You didn't survive the reach, Kaelen. You caused it." The room went silent. Kira looked from Celine to Kaelen, her hand gripping her baton so hard her knuckles turned white. Dr. Vaughn was frantically typing into her slate, her eyes wide with a terrifying kind of greed. "A void anchor," Dr. Vaughn muttered. "A living, breathing gateway to the probability stream." This is what Malachor was building. The internal comm system chirped. It was Hesperia's voice, colder than ever. "Bring him to the Cathedral of Silt. The hegemony fleet has just exited hyperspace. They are demanding their property." "Property?" Kira snapped, looking at Kaelen. "Is that what you are?" "I'm a student," Kaelen rasped, standing up and wiping the sweat from his brow. His eyes were no longer muddy brown. For a heartbeat, they swirled with a deep, violent violet light. "And I think I'm done with the orientation." Kira stepped in front of him, her silver fur bristling. "You aren't going anywhere except where we tell you." "Try to keep up, then," Kaelen said. In that moment, the station rocked with a massive impact. The white lights of the isolation wing flickered and died, replaced by the harsh, rotating red of emergency power. The artificial gravity dipped for a second, making everyone feel weightless. "They're here," Celine whispered, looking at the ceiling. "The quiet ones. The ones with no heartbeats. A squad of obsidian headhunters, elite spec ops clad in matte black armor that absorbed the red emergency lights, phased through the blast door as if it were made of smoke. They didn't use blasters. They used phase nets." Kira reacted with the speed of a predator. She lunged at the lead soldier, her claws raking across his faceplate. Celine unleashed a pulse of bioelectricity that shorted out the nearest soldier's stealth field. But there were too many. Kaelen stood in the center of the chaos. He could see it again. The 10-second window. He saw the soldier behind Kira raising a gravity spike. He saw the net being thrown at Celine. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He reached out his hand and grabbed the air itself. The Loom-Silt in the walls groaned. The red emergency lights turned violet. For a microsecond, the probability of the soldiers being in that room dropped to 0. They didn't die. They were simply pushed. The 3 headhunters were suddenly 10 meters back in the corridor, the blast door slamming shut and welding itself with a surge of heat. Kaelen slumped against the pedestal, his nose bleeding. "What did you do?" Kira gasped, staring at the sealed door. "I changed the outcome," Kaelen whispered. "But it's heavy. It's so heavy." Kira looked at him. She saw the boy from the back row, the one she had wanted to throw out of an airlock. But she also saw the child from the reach, the one who had been turned into a weapon before he could even read. She reached out and grabbed his shoulder. Not as a guard, but as a squad leader. We need to get to the core, Kira said. If the hegemony takes the needle, the whole sector unspools. And if they take me? Kaelen asked. Kira looked him in the eye, her golden pupils sharp. Then I'll be the one to delete you myself. But until then, you're part of my squad. Celine nodded, her light returning. I'll guide us. The silt is screaming, but I can hear the path. They moved out into the darkened corridor. The needle was no longer a school. It was a battlefield where reality was the first casualty. Kaelen Voss walked in the center, no longer hiding. He was the anchor in a world of storms, and for the first time in 10 years, he wasn't afraid of the ghosts. He was the one haunting them. The corridor leading to the Loom-Silt cathedral was no longer a hallway. It was a throat of shifting geometry, swallowing the very concept of distance. One moment, the floor was a solid obsidian walkway. The next, it was a translucent membrane vibrating with the subsonic hum of 1,000 discordant futures. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of wet copper and old lightning. In the void tear, reality didn't just break, it frayed, leaving the threads of what was and what could be tangled in a chaotic knot. Move, Kira barked, her voice cutting through the localized static. Her hand was a steady weight on Kaelen's shoulder, guiding him forward as the walls rippled like silk in a storm. Keep your eyes on the deck plates. Don't look into the seams. Kaelen did as he was told, but his mind was already elsewhere. The Loom-Silt in his marrow was reacting to the cathedral's proximity, a frantic ticking deep within his bones. He could feel the station's distress, not as a sound, but as a series of pressure points behind his eyes. The obsidian headhunters were close, their presence a cold, mathematical void in the shimmering heat of the probability field. They didn't just hunt with blasters, they hunted with anchors, pinning down the fluid reality of the needle until it was brittle enough to shatter. Celine drifted ahead, her crystalline skin glowing with a feverish indigo light. Her fingers traced the air, plucking at invisible strands. The resonance is spiking, she whispered, her voice echoing as if she were speaking from inside a glass jar. The cathedral is trying to protect itself. It's creating a maze. How do we clear it? Kira asked, her golden eyes scanning the flickering shadows. We don't have time for a scenic tour. The Matriarch is waiting at the core, and I'm pretty sure the hegemony has already breached the upper pylon. We don't clear it, Celine said, stopping at a junction where 4 identical passages diverged. We navigate the echoes, but I can't hear the right one. The noise, it's too loud. There's too much grief in the glass. She turned to Kaelen, her eyes wide with a plea she didn't have to voice. Kaelen looked at the 4 doors. To anyone else, they were just steel and shadow. To him, they were 4 distinct screams. The first door smelled of salt water and rot, a future where the life support failed and the station became a drifting tomb. The second hummed with the high-pitched whine of a reactor meltdown. The third was silent, a chilling, absolute vacuum. But the fourth smelled of cheap soap and old iron. It was the smell of his own survival, a stubborn, jagged line of persistence. The far right, Kaelen said, his voice sounding raspy even to himself. That's the path. You sure, Glitch? Kira asked, using the street slang for a cadet with an unstable neural link. Or are you just guessing? Because if you're wrong, we're going to end up as a smudge on the bulkhead. I'm not guessing, Kaelen replied, stepping toward the door. The silt knows the way home. It's the only thing in this universe that doesn't lie. They entered the passage and the world immediately narrowed. The walls drew inward until they were walking single file, the ceiling pressing down like a physical weight. The red emergency strobes had been replaced by a chaotic violet pulse emanating from the lattice threads embedded in the walls. Stay close, Kira ordered, her claws clicking against the floor. Celine, watch the rear. If you hear a heartbeat that isn't ours, scream. They had moved less than 50 meters when the gravity flipped. It wasn't a sudden drop, but a slow, sickening rotation. Suddenly, the wall was the floor, and the ceiling was a vast, yawning abyss. Kaelen stumbled, his boots losing purchase on the vertical surface. Kira caught him, her looping strength pinning him against the vibrating obsidian. Hold on, she grunted, her breath hot against his ear. The anchors are drifting. The hegemony is trying to flip the script. Kaelen closed his eyes. He didn't focus on the gravity. He focused on the noise. Under the panic and the vertigo, there was a rhythm. It was the same rhythm he had felt at Obscura Reach when the world began to tear. It was a countdown. 10 seconds, Kaelen whispered. 10 seconds for what? Kira demanded. Before the next shift. We need to move now. Run for the archway. They scrambled along the wall, their movements awkward and heavy. Kaelen felt the pressure building in his skull, a localized probability surge. 5 seconds. 4. They reached the archway just as the gravity snapped back to center. They hit the floor hard, the impact jarring their bones. Behind them, the corridor they had just exited didn't just collapse, it inverted. The metal twisted like paper, folding into a point of infinite density before vanishing into a cloud of fine, violet dust. That was a close one, Celine gasped, her light flickering as she struggled to regain her balance. We almost got spooled. You okay, Voss? Kira asked, helping him up. You're shaking. I'm fine, Kaelen lied, but his hands were trembling, and he could feel the heat radiating from his own skin. Every time he interacted with the silt, it felt like a layer of his own self was being scraped away. He wasn't just using a tool, he was burning his own history to fuel the fire. They were now in a wide circular chamber, the antechamber of the cathedral. The ceiling was a dome of raw, unrefined null glass, looking out into the violet heart of the void tier. Outside, the nebula swirled like a wounded god, and hanging in the distance was the obsidian hegemony flagship, the Vantari. It looked like a jagged obsidian needle, cold and absolute against the chaotic light. Look, Celine whispered, pointing at the center of the room. A group of first-year cadets were huddled near a pillar, trapped inside a localized gravity well. They were younger than Kaelen, their faces masks of raw, unadulterated terror. They couldn't move. The pressure was so intense it was pinning them to the deck, their bones groaning under the weight of 5 times the normal gravity. Oh gods, one of the girls sobbed. Please, it's so heavy. Kira moved toward them, but she stopped 10 meters away as a warning chime rang out from her wrist link. Hazard detection. It's a deadlock trap. If anyone crosses that perimeter, the gravity triples. It'll turn them into pancakes. We have to help them, Celine said, her crystalline skin pulsing with empathetic pain. I can hear their heartbeats. They're failing. We can't, Kira said, her voice tight with a frustration that bordered on rage. We don't have the override codes. The Matriarch is the only one who can drop the localized fields. If we try to breach it, we kill them faster. Kaelen looked at the students. He saw himself 10 years ago, lying on that table in the Obscura Reach labs. He saw the same look of helplessness, the same realization that they were just variables in someone else's equation. He felt the old rage, the cold, pressurized anger that had been simmering in his gut for a decade. There's another way, Kaelen said. Voss, don't, Kira warned, sensing the shift in his energy. You're already at the limit. You push any harder, and you're going to pop. The probability isn't fixed, Kaelen said, walking toward the perimeter line. The trap thinks they are in that space because the sensors say they are. But what if the sensors are wrong? He reached out his hand, his fingers twitching in the air. The air around his palm began to distort, the violet light of the cathedral flowing into his skin. He wasn't trying to fight the gravity. He was trying to introduce a counter variable. He was darning the hole in reality with his own scars. Kaelen, stop, Celine cried. You're bleeding. Kaelen didn't feel the blood trickling from his nose. He didn't feel the heat. He felt the students. He felt their fear, their weight, their life. He visualized the gravity well as a physical object, a heavy iron bell. He didn't try to lift it. He tried to make it forget it was heavy. In his mind, he reached back to the silence. He pulled the memories of Obscura out of the box. The cold, the fire, the pain. He didn't push them away. He embraced them. He used the weight of his own trauma as a counterweight to the trap. You think this is heavy, he thought? I've been carrying a dead planet for 10 years. This is nothing. The hum of the gravity well changed pitch. The crushing weight on the students didn't vanish, but it shifted. It became a liquid, a flow. Now, Kaelen roared, his voice sounding like a tectonic plate snapping. Crawl! Get out of the circle! The first years didn't hesitate. They scrambled, their movements frantic, sliding across the obsidian floor as the gravity wavered. One by one, they cleared the perimeter. As the last student tumbled into Kira's waiting arms, Kaelen let go. The gravity well didn't just return, it slammed down with the force of a falling moon. The floor of the chamber cracked, a spider web of fissures radiating from the center. The sound was deafening, a localized thunderclap that shook the very foundations of the spire. Kaelen fell to his knees, his vision blurring. The violet light in his eyes was fading, replaced by a cold, crushing gray. He felt empty, a hollowed-out shell of a human being. "You idiot," Kira whispered, kneeling beside him. She wasn't angry. Her voice was thick with a strange, fierce respect. "You absolute beautiful idiot." The cadets huddled behind Celine, looking at Kaelen with awe and terror. "Thank you," the girl with the feathers whispered. "Thank you, back row boy." Kaelen didn't answer. He couldn't. He was too busy trying to keep his soul from leaking out through the cracks. "Movement!" Celine cried, her light turning a sharp warning red. "Sector 7, the headhunters." A group of black-armored figures emerged from the shadows of the pillars. They didn't run. They marched, their movements synchronized and terrifyingly efficient. Their helmets were featureless, save for a single red slit that scanned the room with thermal precision. "Extraction Team Alpha," a synthesized voice boomed from the lead soldier. "Target acquired. Subject 7 is to be retrieved. All other variables are to be deleted." Kira stood up, her stun baton extending with a menacing hum. "Over my dead body," she snarled, her lupine instincts flaring. "My squad, my rules." The headhunters didn't argue. They raised their weapons, phase rifles that fired concentrated beams of unstable reality. "Move the kids into the stairwell," Kira ordered, firing her own pulse pistol. "Celine, cover the flank. Voss, get up. We need to move." Kaelen struggled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the headhunters. He saw the symbols on their armor, the three-pointed star of the obsidian hegemony, the same star that had been burned into the sky over Obscura Reach. The rage came back, but this time, it wasn't a fire. It was a cold, absolute zero. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He stepped into the light. "You want the asset?" Kaelen said, his voice echoing through the cathedral. "Then come and get it." He raised his hands and the Loom-Silt lattice in the ceiling began to scream. The Cathedral of Silt was the most sacred and the most dangerous place in Ethelgard. It was here that the raw probability threads were gathered and woven into the stability fields that kept the station from drifting into the void. The room was a vast, hollow spire, lined with countless crystalline archives, jars of glowing silt that held the distilled memories of 1,000 civilizations. It was a library of things that might have been, a record of the paths not taken. As the headhunters opened fire, the cathedral reacted. The phase bolts didn't hit the walls. They were absorbed by the lattice, redirected into the archives. Each hit caused a jar to shatter, releasing a burst of fragmented history into the air. Suddenly, the room was filled with ghosts. A battalion of soldiers from a war 3 centuries ago marched through the floor. A woman in a royal gown sat weeping on a bench that wasn't there. A child chased a ball through the crossfire, oblivious to the plasma bolts sizzling overhead. The cathedral was bleeding its secrets, and the resulting chaos was a sensory overload that baffled even the headhunters' sophisticated scanners. "Targeting sensors jammed," one of the soldiers reported, his voice distorted by the temporal static. "Environment is unstable. Switching to manual." Kira didn't wait for them to adjust. She was a silver blur, weaving through the ghosts and the gunfire. She didn't use her pistol. She used her claws. She lunged at the nearest soldier, her lupine strength allowing her to rip the phase rifle right out of his hands. She slammed her elbow into his helmet, the visor cracking under the impact. "Stay behind the pillars," Kira yelled to the first years. "Celine, keep them anchored." Celine stood in the center of the cadets, her hands glowing with a steady, stabilizing blue light. She wasn't fighting the soldiers. She was fighting the station. She was acting as a human phase anchor, keeping the children from being swept away by the rising tide of ghosts. "Kaelen, do something!" Celine cried, her light flickering as a jar of silt exploded nearby, releasing the memory of a volcanic eruption. "I can't hold them all." Kaelen stood in the center of the storm. He didn't feel the heat of the plasma or the cold of the vacuum. He felt the archives. He felt the thousands of lives trapped in the glass, the stories that had never been told. He felt their desire to be free, to be seen. He didn't fight the headhunters. He spoke to the ghosts. You want to be heard? Kaelen thought, his mind opening to the scream of the silt. Then show them what you remember. He didn't just introduce a variable. He opened the floodgates. The violet light in the cathedral surged, turning into a blinding white. The ghosts didn't just flicker, they became solid. For a microsecond, the past was more real than the present. The headhunters were suddenly surrounded, not by shadows, but by 1,000 screaming voices. A wave of ancient soldiers surged over them, their spectral blades clashing against the matte black armor. The floor beneath the soldiers turned into a swamp, a memory of a forgotten world, dragging their heavy boots into the muck. What is this? The headhunter leader roared, his phase shield flickering as a spectral arrow hammered against it. This is not a simulation. It's a revolution, Kaelen whispered, his eyes glowing with the intensity of a dying star. The chaos provided the opening they needed. Kira grabbed the 2 nearest cadets and shoved them toward the service lift at the back of the chamber. Move! Get to the lower decks! Celine followed, her blue light forming a protective shell around the remaining students. She looked back at Kaelen, her eyes wide with terror and admiration. Voss, come on! We have to go! Go, Kaelen said. I'll hold the door. Kira stopped, her hand on the lift controls. Voss, don't play the hero. You've already done enough. If you stay here, they'll pin you down. I'm not being a hero, Kaelen said, his voice flat. I'm being a distraction. If I leave, the ghosts vanish. The soldiers will catch you before you reach the reactor level. He looked at Kira, and for the first time he smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had finally found a use for his own wreckage. Go, Kira. Protect the pack. Kira stared at him for a long heartbeat. Her ears twitched, her tail held perfectly still. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say goodbye. She just nodded, her golden eyes reflecting the violet fire in his. Bug out, Voss, she said, using the military slang for an emergency retreat. And don't you dare get spooled. I still have to file a report on your insubordination. The lift doors hissed shut, and Kaelen was alone in the cathedral. The headhunters had finally cleared the spectral soldiers, their armor scorched and dented. They stood in a semicircle around Kaelen, their weapons raised. Subject 7, the leader said, his voice cold and metallic. The Exarch has been patient. He has allowed you to play your little games at this academy. But the time for harvest has come. You will return to the hegemony. I'm not going back to the lab, Kaelen said. You don't have a choice, the soldier replied. You are not a human, Voss. You are a prototype. You are the key to a future where we control every outcome. Why struggle for a broken station when you could rule a perfect universe? Because a perfect universe doesn't have a place for someone like me, Kaelen said. He looked at the pillars of null glass. He looked at the shattered jars on the floor. He felt the silt in his marrow vibrating in sync with the cathedral's core. He didn't feel like a weapon. He didn't feel like an asset. He felt like a boy who was tired of being quiet. He reached out and touched the central pillar, the one that held the station's main probability drive. The headhunters fired. Kaelen didn't dodge. He didn't shield. He just closed his eyes. The phase bolts hit him, but they didn't tear his flesh. They hit the silt. They hit the memories. They hit the lead box. The box didn't just open. It detonated. A wave of violet energy erupted from Kaelen's body, a localized reality collapse. The cathedral groaned, the glass pillars cracking as the gravity inverted, shifted, and then shattered. The headhunters were caught in the blast, their armor failing as the probability of their existence in that room was overwritten by the probability of them being back on their ship, 1,000 kilometers away. Phasing, the leader gasped, his body flickering into static. Error. Coordinates. Corrupted. They vanished. Their retreat not a choice, but a geographical necessity. Kaelen stood in the center of the ruined cathedral. The ghosts were gone. The light was fading. The air was cold and silent. He looked down at his hands. They were shimmering, his skin translucent enough to show the violet threads of the silt running through his veins like glowing nerves. He felt the station's distress pulse again. The hegemony fleet was moving in for the kill. The Vantari was powering up its main cannon, a weapon designed to erase the needle from the probability stream. He had held the door, but the door was no longer there. A soft sound came from the shadows behind the central pillar. Kaelen turned, his hand glowing with a dying light. Matriarch Hesperia stepped out. She wasn't wearing her porcelain mask. Her face was old, her feathers thin and gray. Her eyes were not violet censers, but a deep, sorrowful black. "You did well, Subject 7, she said, her voice a dry whisper. "You knew," Kaelen said, his voice trembling with exhaustion. "You knew they were coming. You knew what I was." "I knew you were a survivor," Hesperia said, walking toward him, "and I knew that Ethelgard needed a survivor." "The Obsidian hegemony is not here for the station, Kaelen. They are here for the anchor. They are here for you." "You used me as bait," Kaelen accused, the rage bubbling up again. "You put those cadets in danger just to see if I would react." "I put the universe in danger to see if it would fight back," Hesperia corrected. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes searching his face. "The Loom-Silt is not a toy, Kaelen. It is a burden. Malachor wants to use it to control the future. I want to use it to preserve the present, but neither of us can touch the core. Only you can." "Why?" Kaelen asked. "Because you are the only one who has already lost everything," Hesperia said. "You have no future to protect. You only have the truth." She reached out her hand, her long clawed fingers trembling. "Come, Kaelen. The Exarch is waiting in the Cathedral of Silt. He thinks he is here to collect a weapon. Let us show him that he is here to face a soul." Kaelen looked at her hand. He looked at the ruined chamber, the shattered memories, the violet dust. He thought about Kira, her fierce protectiveness. He thought about Celine, her empathy. He thought about the first years, their hope. He wasn't just a prototype. He wasn't just a ghost. He was the variable that made the math work. "I'm not going back to the lab," Kaelen said, his voice firming, "but I'm going to end the experiment." He took the Matriarch's hand. They walked toward the heart of the cathedral, where the violet light was brightest, and the noise was finally beginning to sound like a song. The lift doors on the lower decks hissed open. Kira and Celine stepped out, leading the group of cadets into the relative safety of the reactor shielding. Kira looked back up the shaft, her golden eyes fixed on the distant ceiling of the cathedral. The station shook again, a deep, resonant thrum. "He's still up there," Celine whispered, her light dim. "I can still hear him. He's louder than the stars." "He's a back row boy," Kira said, her hand resting on the hilt of her baton. "And back row boys never know when to quit." She turned to the cadets, her voice returning to its military bark. "All right, listen up. We've got a station to hold and a glitch to support. If any of you so much as sneeze in the wrong direction, you're on latrine duty for a month. Move!" As they disappeared into the bowels of the station, a single violet spark fell from the ceiling, drifting like a snowflake in the cold, pressurized air. It didn't vanish. It glowed, a small, stubborn light in the encroaching dark. The substructure of the needle was never intended for living eyes. It was a labyrinth of raw engineering and exposed probability conduits, a place where the station's skeletal remains met the fluid, unpredictable nature of the void tear. As Kira led Celine and the trembling first years deeper into the mosaics, the walls began to take on a terrifying beauty. The obsidian plating had been overwritten by Loom-Silt, transforming the corridors into shifting murals of glass and light. These were the mosaics, projections of every discarded moment in the station's history, frozen in crystalline form. "Keep your eyes forward and your feet moving," Kira barked, her silver fur catching the prismatic glare of a mural depicting a star going supernova. "This isn't a gallery, it's a minefield. Stay frost, cadets. If you start seeing your own birthdays in the glass, it means the silt is starting to digest your brain." The silver lupin leader was pushing herself to the limit. Her senses were dialed to 11, her ears twitching at the sound of the station's metal hull groaning under the pressure of the obsidian hegemony's tractor beams. She could feel the vibration of the Vantari's main cannon through the soles of her boots. They had less than 20 minutes before the station was zeroed out of existence. One of the cadets, a small boy with skin like polished copper, stumbled. He stared into a fragment of glass that showed a version of himself sitting at a dining table with parents who had been dead for 5 years. He reached out a hand, his eyes glazed with a dangerous longing. "Mama?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Kira was there in a heartbeat. She grabbed his wrist and yanked him back with a force that made him yelp. "Don't you dare," she hissed, her golden eyes burning with a fierce, protective anger. "That's not your mother, kid. That's just a math error trying to lure you into the deep end. You want to see her again? Then stay alive. Now move!" Celine drifted beside them, her crystalline skin humming with a low, dissonant tone. Her light was a pale, sickly blue, reflecting the psychic weight of the mosaics. "It's so heavy here, Kira," Celine murmured. "The glass. It's not just showing the past. It's weeping for the things that never happened. I can feel the grief of 1,000 unlived lives." "Then stop feeling and start anchoring," Kira snapped, though her own heart was thudding against her ribs. "We need a sit rep on the reactor core." "How far?" 600 meters, Celine replied, her voice sounding hollow. "But the geometry is drifting. The path is lengthening. The station is trying to become a circle." While Kira and her team fought through the physical madness of the mosaics, Kaelen Voss was trapped in a battlefield of the mind. He stood in the center of the cathedral, but the cathedral was gone. In its place was a city of blinding gold and white marble, stretching toward a sky that was a perfect, unchanging azure. There was no noise here, no static, no smell of burning atmosphere or recycled air. "Welcome to the Citadel of Constant Truth," a voice said. Exarch Malachor stood at the end of a long, pristine plaza. He wasn't wearing his battle armor. He wore robes of white silk, his face handsome and untroubled by the passage of time. He looked like a god who had forgotten the meaning of sorrow. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Malachor asked, gesturing to the city. "No wars, no poverty, no children screaming in the dark. In this reality, the obsidian hegemony didn't burn Obscura Reach. We optimized it, we integrated it. Every soul in this sector lives in a state of perpetual harmony." Kaelen looked at his own hands. They were steady. The violet scars were gone. He felt light, as if a mountain had been lifted from his shoulders. "Where is the catch?" Kaelen asked, his voice echoing in the perfect silence. "There is no catch, Subject 7, Malachor replied, walking closer. "There is only a choice. You are the void anchor. Your nervous system is the only thing that can bridge the gap between this possibility and the broken world you currently inhabit. If you surrender your will to me, I can make this city real. I can overwrite the pain. I can give you back your mother. I can give you a life where you never had to sit in the back row." Malachor reached out a hand. "All you have to do is let go of the noise. Let go of the anger. It's a heavy burden for a boy of 18, Kaelen. Why cling to a history of ash when you can hold a future of gold?" Kaelen looked at the city. He saw the people walking the streets. They were smiling. They were happy. But as he looked closer, he noticed something. Their eyes didn't move. Their shadows were all the same length. They didn't have the jagged, unpredictable energy of the students at Ethelgard. They didn't have the grit of Kira or the soft, empathetic light of Celine. "They're statues," Kaelen whispered. "They are stable," Malachor corrected. "Stability is the ultimate mercy. Would you rather see them bleed? Would you rather see that lupine girl, Kira, torn apart by the probability currents of a dying station? Because that is what happens if you refuse. I will erase Ethelgard. I will erase every memory of your friends. They will be as if they never were." The image shifted. Kaelen saw Kira. She was in the mosaics, her silver fur matted with sweat, her eyes filled with a desperate, stubborn hope as she shielded the cadets. He saw Celine, her light fading as she poured her soul into the station's anchors. He saw the first years, terrified but alive, clinging to the chance he had given them. "They are broken, Kaelen," Malachor said, his voice a seductive purr. "They are flawed, messy, and destined to suffer. Why save a tragedy when you can create a masterpiece?" Kaelen felt the temptation pulling at him like a gravity well. It would be so easy to say yes, to let the noise stop, to finally, for once in his life, feel like he belonged somewhere that wasn't on fire. He looked at the golden city, and for a moment he almost reached out. But then he felt a phantom pain in his wrist, the place where Kira had held him. It was a sharp, grounding ache. It was real. The city is a lie, Kaelen said, his voice hardening. It is a potential, Malachor countered. No, Kaelen said, stepping back. It's a cage. You want to optimize the universe because you're afraid of the dark. You're afraid of the parts of us that you can't predict. You think our flaws are mistakes. But those mistakes are the only things that make us real. He looked Malachor in the eye, and the violet light began to bleed back into his vision. The golden city started to crack. The azure sky turned the color of a bruise. My mother didn't die so I could become a ghost in your dollhouse, Kaelen growled. She died so I could have a choice. And I choose the mess. I choose the pain. I choose the noise. The golden city shattered like a cheap mirror. The sound was a deafening scream of 1,000 unlived futures. Kaelen was back in the cathedral, his knees hitting the cold obsidian. He was bleeding from his nose and ears, but the violet fire in his eyes was brighter than the sun. Back in the mosaics, Kira stopped. She felt a surge of energy ripple through the floor, a vibration that felt like a heartbeat. Did you feel that? She asked, her fur standing on end. He's fighting back, Celine said, her light flaring with a sudden, intense blue. He's rejecting the optimization. Good, Kira said, her golden eyes narrowing. Now let's make sure he has something to come back to. We're almost at the core. They reached the final door of the substructure, a massive, circular hatch marked with the seal of the Ethelgard founders. It was a piece of ancient technology, heavy and uncompromising. Celine, get the cadets into the alcoves, Kira ordered. I need to override this lock. Kira stepped up to the terminal and began to interface her wrist link. She was expecting a standard security wall. What she found was a nightmare of encrypted subroutines. As she dug into the station's deep-layer logs, looking for a way through, a file caught her eye. It was marked with the Matriarch's private signature. Kira hesitated. She was a soldier. She followed orders. But something in the way Hesperia had looked at Kaelen, not as a student, but as a fuse, made her fingers itch. She bypassed the security wall and opened the file. Her blood turned to ice. It was a contingency plan. Operation Null Gate. Hesperia hadn't brought Kaelen to Ethelgard to protect him. She had brought him here to wait for the obsidian hegemony to arrive. The file detailed how the station's anchors had been intentionally weakened 3 months ago to draw Malachor in. Hesperia wanted to trigger a total reality collapse using Kaelen as the catalyst, a bomb that would take out the entire obsidian fleet at the cost of the station and everyone on it. 300 students, Kira whispered, her voice trembling. She was going to burn 300 students just to take a shot at the Exarch. The logs showed that Hesperia had even known the headhunters would breach the orientation. She had let Jackson be unspooled as a test of Kaelen's stress capacity. Kira slammed her fist against the terminal, the metal denting under her strength. We weren't soldiers, she growled, her voice a low, terrifying snarl. We were just the charcoal for her fire. Kira? Celine asked, sensing the sudden, violent shift in her friend's emotions. What is it? What did you find? Kira looked at Celine. She looked at the first years, who were watching her with eyes full of trust. She realized that she had been a prefect of a prison, an enforcer for a monster who was just as cold as Malachor, only better at hiding it behind feathers and poetry. The Matriarch lied, Kira said, her voice sounding like a blade being sharpened. To all of us. She turned back to the hatch and began to hammer at the code with a savage intensity. She wasn't just trying to get through the door anymore. She was trying to break the world that had betrayed them. Open up, you rusted piece of junk, Kira roared. The hatch groaned. The station shook as the Vantari fired its first warning shot, a beam of dark energy that rattled the very foundations of the mosaics. Dust and violet silt fell from the ceiling like radioactive snow. Inside the cathedral, Kaelen stood up. He felt the betrayal too. The Loom-Silt was a network, and he was the hub. He saw the file Kira was reading as if it were projected on the back of his eyelids. He saw Hesperia standing at the command spire, her violet sensors watching the destruction with a detached academic interest. He looked at the pillars of null glass. He looked at the violet threads running through his own arms. You hear that, Hesperia? Kaelen whispered, his voice vibrating through the station's structural supports. You want a bomb? I'll give you a bomb, but it's not going to blow the way you think. He turned toward the center of the cathedral, where the main probability drive pulsed with a frantic, dying rhythm. He didn't walk. He moved with a strange, broken grace, the air around him flickering as he stepped through the seams of reality. The turning point had arrived. The game of the Matriarch and the Exarch was over. The asset was no longer following the script. Kaelen Voss was 18 years old. He was broken. He was haunted. And he was about to teach the universe that some variables are too big to be solved. The reactor core was a chamber of humming silence, a cathedral of cold fusion and humming probability generators. In the center, a sphere of swirling violet plasma held the station's existence in a delicate balance. This was the heart of the needle, the place where the Loom-Silt was refined and fed into the station's anchors. Kira, Celine, and the cadets burst into the room just as the secondary gravity dampeners failed. For a second, they were tossed into the air, a chaotic jumble of limbs and gear, before the emergency magnets in their boots locked them onto the deck plates with a jarring thud. "Seal the door," Kira yelled, gesturing to the heavy blast shield. "Celine, get to the secondary terminal. I need those stabilizers at 100% or we're all going to be smeared across 3 different dimensions." Celine scrambled to the console, her fingers dancing across the interface. Her crystalline skin was glowing so brightly it was almost painful to look at. The feedback, it's too strong. The Ventari is hammering the outer hull. They're trying to sync their own Silt drive with ours to force a merger. "They want Kaelen," Kira said, checking her stun baton. "They're going to try to pull the whole station into their reality." One of the first years, a girl with skin the color of twilight grabbed Kira's arm. "Is Kaelen coming? You said he'd be here. You said he'd save us." Kira looked down at the girl. She saw the raw, unpolished fear in her eyes. She remembered the Matriarch's file. Sacrifice the pawns to take the king. "He's coming," Kira said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "But we have to give him a reason to stay." She turned back to the terminal, her mind racing. She had been trained to believe that logic was the only path to survival, that emotions were a luxury for civilians. But as she watched the station fall apart around her, she realized that logic was what had brought them to this edge. Logic was why Hesperia was willing to burn them. Logic was why Malachor thought he could win. "Logic is a flatline," Kira whispered. "What was that?" Celine asked, her voice strained as she fought to keep the reactor from peaking. "Nothing," Kira said. "Just thinking about how much I hate math." Suddenly, the air in the center of the room began to thicken. It wasn't smoke. It was a concentration of probability so dense it looked like shimmering liquid. A figure began to emerge from the violet fog. It wasn't a headhunter. It wasn't a soldier. It was a projection of the Matriarch. "Cadet Kira," Hesperia's voice boomed, amplified by the reactor's resonance. "You have exceeded your parameters. You were ordered to remain in the cathedral to assist the anchor's integration. Why have you retreated to the core?" Kira stood her ground, her silver tail lashing behind her. "I found the file, Matriarch. Operation Null Gate. I know what you're planning." Hesperia's projection tilted its head, the long porcelain beak gleaming in the plasma light. "Then you understand the necessity. The obsidian hegemony is a cancer. It consumes every sector it touches. Kaelen Voss is the only scalpel sharp enough to cut it out. His sacrifice will save millions." "His name is Kaelen," Kira roared, her golden eyes flashing. "Not the anchor. Not Subject 7. He's a person. And those millions of lives don't mean anything if you have to turn into a monster to save them." "You are being emotional, Cadet," Hesperia said, her voice dripping with a terrifying, motherly disappointment. "You were chosen for the Apex team because of your capacity for cold, tactical decision-making. Do not disappoint me now. Open the core's bypass and allow the silt to flood the cathedral. It is the only way to end this war." "If I do that, Kaelen dies," Kira said. "Yes," Hesperia replied, "and so do you, and so do the cadets. But the hegemony will be erased. It is a small price to pay for a decade of peace." Kira looked at the first years. She looked at Celine. She felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her like a gravity well. For her entire life, she had been told that the many outweighed the few, that the mission was more important than the man. "I'm done paying your prices, Matriarch," Kira said. She raised her stun baton and slammed it into the projection's primary interface. The holographic image of Hesperia flickered and dissolved into a cloud of static. "Kira!" Celine screamed. "What did you do? You just locked us out of the main system." "I didn't lock us out," Kira said, her breath coming in heavy, jagged gasps. "I just took the steering wheel. We're going to do this my way." While Kira was declaring her rebellion in the core, Kaelen was undergoing a different kind of trial. He was still in the cathedral, but the physical world was starting to blur. He could see the Vantari dreadnought through the ceiling, its main cannon glowing with a terrifying, white-hot energy. He could see the soldiers phasing back into the room, their red eyes fixed on him. But he could also see something else. He could see the threads. The Loom-Silt was no longer a mystery to him. It was a language. He saw the path Hesperia wanted him to take, a violent, destructive surge of energy that would ignite the station like a magnesium flare. He saw the path Malachor wanted, a total surrender of his will to become a living processor for the hegemony's order. And then he saw a third path. It was a thin, jagged line, full of holes and static. It didn't lead to a victory. It didn't lead to a golden city. It led to more pain. It led to more noise. It led to a future where he would never be normal, where he would always be a ghost in a world of flesh. But in that path, Kira was alive. Celine was alive. The first years were alive. They were the flaws in the equation. They were the variables that made the math fail. Kaelen reached out and grabbed that thin, jagged thread. The cathedral screamed. The violet pillars shattered, sending shards of null glass flying through the air like shrapnel. The headhunters tried to fire, but their weapons turned into birds and flew away. They tried to move, but the floor turned into a summer afternoon in a field of tall grass. Kaelen was no longer just an anchor. He was the weaver. He didn't try to destroy the Obsidian fleet. He tried to show them the weight of their own history. He pushed the memories of the thousands of worlds they had conquered back into their own silt drives. He forced the dreadnought to feel the collective grief of a sector. The Vantari didn't explode. It choked. The dark energy in its cannon turned inward, the probability of its own destruction becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. The ship didn't vanish. It aged 3,000 years in 10 seconds. The hull rusted, the engines decayed, and the crew became dust in the wind of a billion forgotten days. Kaelen fell forward, his hands clawing at the obsidian floor. The energy was too much. It was burning his nerves, erasing his own identity to make room for the truth. "I can't hold it," he rasped. Suddenly he felt a presence, a warmth. A silver hand reached through the violet storm and grabbed his. "I told you not to get spooled, Glitch," Kira's voice said. She was there, her body shimmering with the same violet light. Behind her, Celine and the cadets were forming a human chain, their hands locked, their collective will acting as a physical anchor for Kaelen's fading soul. "You're not doing this alone, Kaelen," Celine whispered, her light merging with his. "We are the noise. We are the static." Kaelen looked at them. He saw their fear. He saw their flaws. He saw the way Kira's fur was singed and the way Celine's skin was cracked. He saw the first years, who had no power but their own stubborn refusal to die. They were beautiful. He gripped Kira's hand, his fingers locking with hers. He didn't try to be a weapon anymore. He didn't try to be a hero. He just tried to be a boy who wanted his friends to live. He channeled the energy of the station, but he didn't send it out. He pulled it in. He used the Loom-Silt to mend the cracks in the needle. He used the probability drive to heal the wounds in reality. The violet light began to fade. The cathedral stabilized. The noise didn't stop, but it became a harmony. Outside, the Vantari drifted away, a ghost of a ship, no longer a threat. The Obsidian fleet, their minds shattered by the truth Kaelen had shown them, broke formation and scattered into the void. The station was silent. Kaelen lay on the floor, his head resting in Kira's lap. He was pale, his eyes closed. The violet threads in his veins were still there, but they were dim, a quiet glow under his skin. "Is it over?" the small copper-skinned cadet asked, peering over Celine's shoulder. Kira looked at the ruined cathedral. She looked at the scars on Kaelen's face. She looked at the empty space where the Matriarch's authority used to be. "No," Kira said, her voice soft but firm. "It's just beginning." She looked down at Kaelen, her golden eyes filled with a tenderness she had never allowed herself to feel. "We graduated, Glitch." Kaelen opened one eye and gave her a weak, lopsided smile. "Does that mean I don't have to take the final exam?" "No," Kira said, a small, genuine laugh breaking through her fatigue. "It means you're the one who has to write the textbook." But as they sat there in the quiet of the saved station, a new sound began to echo from the command spire. It wasn't the sound of an enemy fleet. It was the sound of a countdown. Hesperia wasn't done. The Matriarch had one final tactical move. If she couldn't have a weapon, she would have a martyr. The station's self-destruct sequence had been initiated. 50 credits says we have less than 5 minutes, Kira muttered, her ears flattening. Kaelen sat up, his face hardening. The game was still on, but this time, the players were playing for keeps. Kaelen looked at the team, the silver lupine, the crystalline empath, the forgotten orphans. They were a mess. They were a tragedy. They were exactly what the universe needed. "Let's go," Kaelen said. "We have a headmistress to fire." The command spire of Ethelgard was no longer a pinnacle of architectural triumph. It had become a vertical nightmare of unspooling physics. As Kaelen, Kira, and their ragtag assembly of survivors began the ascent, the very concept of up and down surrendered to the whim of the Loom-Silt. The central lift had been zeroed out minutes ago, its shaft now a hollow throat of violet lightning and screaming metal. They were forced to climb the emergency maintenance struts, a skeletal spine of cold alloy that vibrated with the station's impending extinction. "Keep your grip tight and your head down," Kira growled, her voice straining against the roar of the atmospheric recyclers. Her silver fur was stained with soot and the dark, iridescent blood of the headhunters she had dispatched in the lower decks. "We have 4 floors of hard light wreckage to clear before we reach the Matriarch's perch. If the gravity fails again, just maglock your boots and pray your internal organs don't decide to swap places." Beside her, Celine was a flickering candle in the dark. The crystalline girl's light had turned a jagged, frantic orange, the color of a warning flare. "The station is crying, Kira," Celine whispered, her hands trembling as they gripped the vibrating metal. "It's not just the hull. It's the souls inside the glass. They're being compressed. Hesperia isn't just ending the station. She's erasing the archive." "Then we'll just have to give her a reason to stop the delete," Kaelen said. He moved with a fluidity that was almost terrifying to watch. While the others struggled with the shifting gravity, Kaelen seemed to anticipate every lurch. His eyes were wide, the pupils replaced by swirling nebulae of violet light. He wasn't just climbing, he was reading the air. He saw the probability of the next strut collapsing 2 seconds before the metal groaned. He saw the pockets of hard vacuum forming in the corners of the stairwell. "Voss, watch the left!" Kira yelled as a massive chunk of obsidian plating sheared off the wall, tumbling upward into the void. Kaelen didn't flinch. He reached out a hand, his fingers twitching in a complex pattern. The obsidian plate slowed, its trajectory warping as if it had hit a patch of invisible molasses. It drifted harmlessly past them, glowing with a soft, violet hue. "Save the parlor tricks, Glitch," Kira panted, her breath hitching. "You're leaking silt like a punctured fuel line. You keep burning through your reserves like this, and there won't be enough of you left to face the old bird." "I'm not burning," Kaelen replied, his voice sounding distant, like it was being broadcast from another room. "I'm finally conducting." They reached the 300th level, where the spire opened into a wide, glass-walled observation deck. The view was a masterpiece of horror. The Obsidian Hegemony fleet was a swarm of dark hornets against the violet tapestry of the Void Tear. The Vantari dreadnought, though crippled and rusted from Kaelen's earlier assault, was still a massive, looming threat. But the real danger was inside. The station's self-destruct sequence was pulsing through the floors, a deep, rhythmic thud that felt like a countdown to the end of time. At the far end of the deck, trapped behind a shimmering wall of unstable probability, was Matriarch Hesperia. She was slumped against the command console, her iridescent feathers gray and brittle. The porcelain mask she usually wore lay shattered on the floor, revealing a face that was deeply, humanly tired. Her violet eyes were fixed on the countdown timer, 3 minutes and 42 seconds. Hesperia, Kira roared, her stun baton sparking as she slammed it against the probability barrier. Shut it down, you've won. Malachor is retreating. You don't have to burn the kids. The matriarch turned her head slowly, her movements jerky and stiff. The war does not end with a retreat, Kira, she whispered, her voice amplified by the room's dying acoustics. It ends with an erasure. As long as the anchor exists, the hegemony will return. As long as the needle stands, it is a target. The logic is absolute. The many for the few. That's some high-grade slag, even for you, Matriarch, Kira hissed, her golden eyes narrowed to slits. You're not saving the many. You're just afraid of a future you can't control. You're trying to tidy up the universe because you can't stand the mess. The probability barrier flared, a wall of jagged glass shards appearing in the air. You do not understand the weight, Hesperia said, her voice rising in a sudden, frantic pitch. I have held this station together for 50 years. I have watched 1,000 futures turn to ash. I chose the one that resulted in the least amount of blood, and it's still too much blood. Celine cried, stepping forward. Her light was pulsing a soft, healing blue now, a desperate counter-rhythm to the station's death throe. I can feel the children in the reactor, Matriarch. They're not numbers. They're names. They're heartbeats. They're real. Hesperia looked at Celine, and for a second her resolve seemed to flicker. But then she looked at Kaelen. She saw the violet nebula in his eyes, the way the reality around him bowed and scraped to his presence. He is the gateway, Hesperia whispered, her finger hovering over the final authorization key. He is a wound in the universe that will never heal. I am merely closing the door. She pressed the key. The station let out a sound that wasn't a noise but a shift in the soul. The gravity didn't just fail, it vanished. They were suddenly weightless, drifting in a room that was rapidly dissolving into violet dust. The countdown timer hit 2 minutes. Kira launched herself at the barrier, her claws raking across the shimmering surface. It's locked. She slaved the sequence to her own biosignature. We can't override it without her. Kaelen walked forward. He didn't drift. He stepped through the air as if it were solid ground. Every time his boot touched the void, a small ripple of violet light stabilized the space beneath him. He reached the barrier and placed his hand against it. Voss, don't! Kira screamed. That barrier is a feedback loop. It'll unspool you. Kaelen didn't listen. He looked at Hesperia through the shimmering glass. He saw the woman who had stolen his memories, the woman who had turned him into a weapon, the woman who was currently trying to delete him from existence. He felt the old rage, the cold desire to simply reach through the barrier and turn her into static. It would be so easy. It would be the logical thing to do. But he remembered the feeling of Kira's hand on his wrist. He remembered the smell of the first year's fear and the sound of Celine's crystalline song. He didn't want to be a weapon anymore. He didn't want to be a prototype. I'm not a wound, Kaelen said, his voice quiet but echoing through the entire spire. I'm the stitch. He didn't fight the barrier. He didn't try to break it. He closed his eyes and reached for the noise, the collective grief, the trauma, the messy, beautiful chaos of his own broken history. He didn't push it away. He didn't lock it in a lead box. He opened his arms and invited it in. The barrier didn't shatter. It melted. The probability shards turned into rain, soft violet droplets that smelled of ozone and spring. The unstable energy of the feedback loop didn't burn Kaelen. It flowed into him, a million fragmented stories seeking a home. He absorbed the feedback, his skin glowing with such intensity that Kira and Celine had to shield their eyes. Kaelen stepped through the dissolved barrier and stood before the matriarch. Hesperia looked up at him, her eyes wide with a terror that surpassed her logic. What? What are you? I'm Kaelen Voss, he said, his voice a harmony of 1,000 ghosts. And I'm staying. He reached out and grabbed her hand, the one that had just authorized their death. He didn't crush it. He held it. He forced her to see what he saw. He didn't show her a golden city or a perfect future. He showed her the back row. He showed her the smudge on the lens. He showed her the beautiful, flawed, screaming reality of a station full of children who just wanted to grow up. The matriarch gasped, her body jerking as the experiential download hit her. She felt the name of every cadet. She felt the weight of their dreams. She felt the jagged, glorious mess of being human. The countdown hit 60 seconds. Abort it, Kaelen whispered. Not because it's logical, but because they're yours. Hesperia's hand trembled. Tears, real and salt-heavy, fell from her eyes, splashing onto the console. I can't. The sequence is slaved to the Loom-Silt core. It's too late for a manual override. The station is already unspooling. Then we'll just have to weave a new story, Kaelen said. He turned back to Kira and Selene. Kira, get the survivors to the escape pods in Sector 9. Selene, I need you to anchor the pods. Use everything you have. Don't worry about the station. Worry about the people. What about you? Kira asked, her voice cracking for the first time. Voss, you can't hold this much energy. You're going to pop like a supernova. I'm not going to pop, Kaelen said, a small, sad smile playing on his lips. I'm just going to be a little loud for a while. Now move! Bug out, Kira. That's an order from your asset. Kira stared at him, her golden eyes shimmering with a fierce, painful pride. She didn't argue. She didn't waste time with goodbyes. She grabbed Selene's hand and turned toward the stairwell. Don't you dare get spooled, glitch, she roared over her shoulder. If you're not there when the pods launch, I'm coming back to haunt you. Kaelen watched them go, his light beginning to bleed into the walls of the spire. He was alone with the Matriarch, the countdown hitting 30 seconds. The station began to moan, a sound of structural failure on a galactic scale. The violet light was no longer a glow, it was a flood. Ready? Kaelen asked Hesperia. The Matriarch looked at him, her fear replaced by a strange, quiet dignity. She reached out and placed her other hand on his shoulder. I am sorry, Kaelen, for everything. Don't be sorry, Kaelen said, his voice becoming a roar of violet thunder. Be the witness. He slammed his hands into the command console, and the universe turned inside out. The unspooling was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical reality. As the needle reached the final 10 seconds of its existence, the laws of causality surrendered. In the reactor core, the violet plasma didn't explode. It expanded into a beautiful, terrifying forest of probability trees, their branches reaching through the bulkheads and out into the void. Kira and Selene were in the escape pod hangar of Sector 9, a place that was rapidly becoming a non-location. The floor was turning into water, and the ceiling was a mosaic of 1,000 different nights. Get them inside, Kira screamed, shoving the last of the first years into a reinforced pod. Selene, anchor us! Now! Selene stood at the center of the hangar, her crystalline skin glowing with such a pure, intense blue that she looked like a fallen star. She was singing. It wasn't a song of words, but a song of structural integrity. She was weaving her own bioelectricity into the hull of the pods, creating a pocket of stable reality in the middle of the storm. Hold on, Selene cried, her voice cracking as the hangar around them dissolved into violet dust. I can't hold the station. You don't have to hold the station, Kira roared, her mag boots straining against the shifting deck. Just hold the pods. Voss has the rest. High above them, in the command spire, Kaelen Voss was no longer a boy. He was a conduit for the entire history of Ethelgard. He felt every bolt, every wire, every memory stored in the silt. He felt the weight of the 300 students, the thousands of archives, and the cold, absolute malice of the obsidian hegemony. He was the gateway. But he didn't open the door for Malachor. He didn't open it for the Matriarch's logic. He opened it for the noise. In those final seconds, Kaelen didn't try to stop the explosion. He tried to transform it. He took the violent, destructive energy of the self-destruct sequence, and he draped it in the colors of his own trauma. He used the pain of obscura reach as a dampener. He used the grief of the unspooled as a shield. He wasn't fixing reality. He was darning it with his own scars. The Vantari dreadnought fired its main cannon, a beam of dark energy designed to erase the needle from history. The beam hit the spire at the exact moment the countdown hit 0. The resulting collision was a silent, blinding flare of violet and black. For 100 light years in every direction, every sensor, every eye, and every mind felt a sudden, sharp pang of intense, beautiful sorrow. In the center of the flare, Kaelen stood. He felt his identity dissolving. He felt the name Kaelen being overwritten by the name Subject 7, and then by 1,000 other names he didn't recognize. He was becoming the Silt. He was becoming the void. No, a voice whispered in his ear. It wasn't Kira. It wasn't the Matriarch. It was his mother. She was there, a flickering image in the violet storm, her hand resting on his cheek. You are not the weapon, Kaelen, she said, her voice sounding like a lullaby over the roar of the apocalypse. You are the one who stays. Kaelen roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of the void tear. He didn't surrender. He didn't let go. He grabbed the dark energy of the hegemony's beam and the violet fire of the station's core, and he twisted them together. He wove them into a singular, impossible thread. He used the energy to launch the escape pods, not just out of the hangar, but out of the sector. He gave them a push that bypassed the standard physics of propulsion, sending them gliding through the probability stream toward the stable systems of the inner rim. The pods vanished into the violet mist, a dozen small, stubborn lights fleeing the dark. Kaelen watched them go, his heart swelling with a feeling that was more powerful than the silt. It was a messy, imperfect, glorious joy. He had saved them, not because it was logical, not because it was his destiny, because he chose to. The spire finally gave way. The metal disintegrated, the glass turned to light, and the gravity anchor snapped. Kaelen and Hesperia were cast out into the void tear, two small figures in a sea of violet chaos. The matriarch looked at Kaelen, her feathers blowing away in the solar wind. You did it, she whispered, her voice fading. You saved the few. I saved the future, Kaelen said, his voice now a quiet hum in the silence of the void. As the needle vanished, leaving behind only a beautiful, shimmering nebula of violet dust, the Vantari dreadnought began to drift. Its systems were dead, its crew catatonic from the psychic feedback of Kaelen's noise. The obsidian hegemony had not been destroyed by a bomb. It had been paralyzed by the truth. Kaelen felt the cold of space encroaching. He felt the violet threads in his veins beginning to go dark. He was drifting, a piece of debris in a galaxy that was finally, for a moment, quiet. He closed his eyes. Voss, a voice barked, muffled by the static of a short-range comms unit. Kaelen opened one eye. A single battered escape pod was drifting a few hundred meters away. It wasn't heading for the inner rim. It had stayed behind. The hatch opened, and a silver figure in a pressurized suit launched out on a tether. Kira. She moved with a frantic, desperate grace, her claws catching the light of the dying nebula. She reached him in the silence of the void, her arms wrapping around his shimmering, translucent form. She slammed her helmet against his, the sound of the impact vibrating through his skull. I told you not to get spooled, she roared through the comms link, her voice thick with tears and rage. Kaelen looked at her golden eyes through the faceplate. He felt the warmth of her suit, the grit of her grip, the reality of her presence. Kira, he whispered. Don't you Kira me, glitch, she grunted, hauling him back toward the pod. We're heading to Nexara Station. I've already got a list of 300 people who want to buy you a drink, and I'm at the top of the list. Kaelen let her pull him. He looked back at the violet nebula where Ethelgard had been. He saw the scars in the fabric of space, the glowing threads of the Loom-Silt that would never truly go away. The station was gone. The matriarch was gone. The lab was gone. But as Kira pulled him into the airlock and the heavy steel door hissed shut, Kaelen Voss realized that he wasn't sitting in the back row anymore. He was in the middle of the mess, and it was exactly where he wanted to be. The escape pod's engines hummed, a small, rhythmic thud that sounded remarkably like a heartbeat. They turned away from the void tear, a tiny, stubborn spark of life heading toward the dawn. Kaelen sat on the floor of the pod, his back against the vibrating wall. He felt the noise under his skin, the ghosts, the memories, the pain. It was still there. It would always be there. But as Kira sat down next to him and rested her silver head on his shoulder, Kaelen realized that the noise wasn't a curse. It was the music of the living. The escape pod, a dented sphere of titanium and desperation, drifted through the silent aftermath like a seed cast into a storm. Inside, the air was thin, smelling of sweat, copper, and the ozone that clung to Kira's fur. The silver lupine was crouched by the airlock, her breathing heavy, her golden eyes fixed on the boy lying in the center of the cramped deck. Kaelen Voss looked less like a human and more like a dying star. The violet threads under his skin were no longer glowing. They were pulsing, a slow, rhythmic ebb and flow that seemed to synchronize with the hum of the pod's life support. "You still with us, Glitch?" Kira asked, her voice raspy. She didn't move toward him. She knew that touching him right now was like touching a live wire. Kalen's eyes fluttered open. The nebula was still there, swirling in his pupils, but it was dimmer, hooded by exhaustion. "I'm here," he whispered. "The noise. It's not screaming anymore. It's just breathing." "It should be," Celine said from the pilot's seat. The crystalline girl was slumped over the controls, her light a pale, translucent gray. Her skin was a map of hairline fractures, the cost of anchoring a reality that had wanted to dissolve. "You broadcasted it, Kaelen. You didn't just fight the Ventari. You gave them every memory, every jagged piece of grief from the archives. They didn't just see the truth. They drowned in it." Kira let out a sharp, cynical bark of a laugh. "I saw their formations break on the long-range sensors. 1,000 military-grade pilots suddenly remembering they have souls. That's a whole lot of static for one afternoon's work. You turned a dreadnought into a therapy session, Voss." Kaelen didn't smile. He felt the weight of those memories still clinging to him. He hadn't just used the silt. He had shared himself. He felt the phantom pain of 300 cadets, the cold calculation of Hesperia, and the terrifying hollow order of Malachor. He was no longer just the boy from the back row. He was the ledger where the station's debt had been recorded. "What happens now?" Kaelen asked, looking at the ceiling. "Now?" Kira stood up, her mag boots clicking softly. "We reach Nexera Station. We tell the council what the Matriarch was cooking, and then we fade out. The hegemony is fractured, but they're not gone. They'll be looking for Subject 7 until the heat death of the universe." "I'm not Subject 7, Kaelen said, his voice firming. "I know," Kira said, stepping closer. For the first time, she didn't look at him as a liability or an asset. She looked at him with a fierce, weary camaraderie. "You're the guy who ruined my perfect record. You're a tactical disaster, Voss. And you're the only person I know who can stare into a probability well and decide to pick a fight with the math." 3 days later, the pod docked at Nexera Station, a sprawling, gritty trade hub hanging on the edge of the neutral zone. It was the opposite of Ethelgard. There were no clinical white floors, no swirling violet lattices, and no predatory matriarchs. It was a place of rust, neon, and the beautiful, chaotic noise of 1,000 different species trying to make a credit. As the airlock hissed open, Kaelen stepped out into the bustling hangar. The gravity was slightly too heavy, the air smelled of fried grease and hydraulic fluid, and the noise was deafening. He should have hated it. He should have wanted to retreat back into the silence. But as he walked through the crowd, his shoulder brushing against a four-armed merchant, his eyes meeting the suspicious gaze of a security droid, he felt a strange, grounding peace. The silt in his veins hummed, but it didn't surge. He didn't see the future. He saw the now. He saw a woman laughing with her child. He saw 2 soldiers arguing over a game of chance. He saw the mess. Kira stayed by his side, her claws retracted but her posture alert. Celine walked on his other side, her light beginning to return to a steady, comforting indigo. The cadets they had saved had already been taken in by the Nexera Refugee Center, their names recorded not as variables, but as survivors. The obsidian hegemony's influence was felt even here, in the hushed whispers of the merchants and the news feeds flickering on every screen. The Truth Echo, the name the sector had given to Kaelen's broadcast, had paralyzed the hegemony's command structure. Reports were coming in of entire fleets standing down, their crews overwhelmed by the experiential data of their own crimes. "It won't last forever," Celine whispered, her eyes fixed on a screen showing the ruined nebula of Ethelgard. "They'll find a way to edit the memories. They'll find a way to make the noise stop. Then we'll just have to keep being loud," Kira said, looking at Kaelen. "Right, Glitch?" Kaelen looked at his hand. The violet threads were faint now, almost invisible. He knew the silt would never truly leave him. He would always be the void anchor. He would always hear the music of the living. But for the first time in 10 years, he realized he didn't have to be a weapon. He could be a witness. "I spent my whole life trying to be invisible," Kaelen said as they walked toward the station's heart. "I thought the scars were a secret I had to keep. I thought the pain was a hole that would eventually swallow me." He stopped and looked at Kira. "But the scars are what let me touch the silt. The pain is what let me hear the kids. The defects, they're the only things that let me change the story." Kira smirked, her golden eyes reflecting the neon lights of the station. "About time you figured it out, Voss. A perfect sword is just a piece of metal. It's the one with the serrated edge that actually cuts through the static." They found a small, crowded canteen near the lower docks. It was a place for spacers and drifters, filled with the smell of synth steak and the sound of a dozen different languages. They sat in a corner booth, the three of them, the silver lupine, the crystalline empath, and the boy with the violet eyes. Kira ordered 3 drinks, bitter, amber liquids that burned the throat and tasted of wood smoke. "To the back row," she said, raising her glass. "To the mess," Celine added. Kaelen raised his glass. "To the people who chose to stay." As he drank, he felt the vibration of the station. He felt the lives swirling around him, each one a unique, unpredictable thread in the tapestry of the universe. He was 18 years old, he was broken, and he was the most powerful being in the sector. But as he looked at Kira and Celine, Kaelen Voss realized that the power didn't come from the silt. It came from the choice to be real. It came from the courage to be loud in a universe that wanted him to be silent. The orientation was over. The lesson had been learned. And as the neon lights of Nexara flickered in the dark, the boy who had once hidden in the shadows finally stepped into the light. 1 month had passed since the fall of Ethelgard. The sector was in a state of fragile, beautiful transition. The obsidian hegemony had retracted its borders, its leaders retreating into the shadows to deal with the internal fallout of the Truth Echo. The academy was being rebuilt, not as a military spire, but as a center for temporal ethics, overseen by a council that actually valued the lives of its students. Kaelen Voss sat on a balcony overlooking the main plaza of Nexara Station. He was no longer wearing the gray flight suit of a cadet. He wore a simple dark jacket and trousers, the clothes of a civilian. The violet light in his eyes had settled into a steady, quiet shimmer, like the reflection of a distant galaxy in a dark lake. He was watching the first years. They had stayed together, forming a small community in the station's residential district. The girl with the feathers was teaching a group of younger children how to read the star charts. The copper-skinned boy was working in a local engineering bay, his hands steady and his eyes no longer clouded by terror. They were safe. They were growing. Kira walked out onto the balcony, her silver fur groomed, her crimson uniform replaced by the tactical gear of a private security consultant. She had refused a commission in the new Federation fleet. She said she was done taking orders from people who didn't know the smell of ozone. "The council wants to see you again," Kira said, leaning against the railing. "They're still trying to figure out if you're a messiah or a walking disaster. 5 credits says they decide on disaster." "Let them," Kaelen said, not looking away from the plaza. "It's a more accurate description." Kira laughed, a sound that was no longer sharp but warm. "You're getting arrogant, Voss. Careful, or I'll have to remind you who dragged your unspooled hide out of the void." "You've reminded me every day for a month, Kira," Kaelen said, finally looking at her. "I think the debt is settled." "It's never settled," she said, her golden eyes softening. "That's the beauty of it." Celine joined them, her crystalline skin glowing with a vibrant, healthy indigo. She had spent the last few weeks working with the refugees, using her empathic gifts to help them process the trauma of the station's collapse. She looked at Kaelen, her head tilting to the side. "The noise is very quiet today," she said. "It's not quiet," Kaelen corrected. "It's just balanced." He looked back at the plaza, at the thousands of lives moving beneath him. He felt the silt in his marrow, but he didn't feel like a weapon anymore. He felt like a bridge. He realized that the Matriarch had been right about one thing. He was a gateway. But he wasn't a gateway to a golden city or a controlled future. He was a gateway to understanding. He understood now that Malakor's optimization was just another word for fear. Malakor was afraid of the parts of humanity that couldn't be measured. He was afraid of the grief, the anger, and the love that drove people to do illogical things. He was afraid of the noise. But Kaelen wasn't afraid anymore. He knew that the noise was the only thing that mattered. He stood up and walked to the edge of the balcony, his hands resting on the cold metal railing. He felt the weight of his journey, the 10 years of silence, the fire of Obscura Reach, the betrayal of Ethelgard. It was a heavy history, full of jagged edges and dark corners. But as he looked at the sun rising over the edge of the station's primary ring, Kaelen Voss realized that he wouldn't trade a single second of it. I used to dream about being normal, Kaelen thought. I used to pray for a life where I didn't have these scars, where I didn't hear the ghosts of every choice I never made. I thought that if I could just erase the pain, I would finally be whole. But I was wrong. The pain wasn't a hole, it was the foundation. The scars aren't the things that are broken. They are the places where I was mended with something stronger than flesh. I look at these children, these survivors, and I see the same jagged lines. I see the way their fear has turned into a fierce, stubborn kindness. I see the way their losses have made them value the now more than any forever. We are a collection of scraps and stutters, a symphony of errors that the universe didn't plan for, and that is exactly why we are the ones who can save it. You don't build a future out of gold. You build it out of the debris of the past, held together by the simple, terrifying choice to keep going. I am loud, I am messy, and I am finally, for the first time in my life, exactly who I am supposed to be. Kaelen turned back to Kira and Selene. "We're not staying here, are we?" he asked. Kira smirked, her golden eyes flashing with a familiar, predatory mischief. "Nixar is a bit too quiet for my taste. I heard there's a localized probability collapse in the Heliox sector. Some old hegemony tech is acting up, turning a mining colony into a game of musical chairs with time." "Sounds like static," Kaelen said. "A whole lot of static," Kira agreed. Kaelen walked toward the door, his boots making a solid, rhythmic thud against the deck. He didn't look back at the back row. He didn't look back at the shadows. He walked with his head held high, his violet eyes fixed on the horizon of a universe that was finally, gloriously unpredictable. "I've been the anchor for a long time," Kaelen said. "I think it's time I became the wind." Kira and Selene followed him, their footsteps merging into a single purposeful rhythm. They were a mess. They were a tragedy. They were the three most dangerous people in the galaxy, and they were just getting started. As the door hissed shut behind them, the station's intercom chirped, a simple rhythmic sound that echoed through the plaza. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a warning. It was just the sound of a new day beginning in a world where anything was possible. Kaelen Voss had spent 18 years waiting for the air to run out, but as he stepped onto the transport heading for the Heliox sector, he realized that he had finally learned how to breathe. He stood by the viewport, his reflection shimmering in the glass. He saw the boy he had been, and he saw the man he was becoming. He saw the noise, and for the first time he realized that the music was beautiful. "What about you?" "I spent years carrying that anger like armor, only to realize it was a prison. I wonder, what are the pieces of yourself you have been trying to optimize or hide away because they felt like broken scraps? What if those very flaws, those jagged edges of your history, are the only things that can actually bridge the gap between who you are and who you were meant to be?" Kaelen Voss reached out and touched the glass, a single violet spark jumping from his finger to the stars. The boy from the back row took his seat at the front, and the universe began to sing.